So the first North Korea-U.S. denuclearization talks in more than 7 months broke down in Stockholm this past weekend. Immediately after the 8.5-hour-long meeting, North Korea said the talks broke down entirely because the U.S. had not discarded its old and came to the table empty-handed. The U.S., on the other hand, said the two sides had good discussions that it intends to build on in 2 weeks, which Pyongyang denied a few hours later. So are we in for another hiatus, or is this a game tactic? Live in the studio with me is John Delury, professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University. John, it's great to have you in the studio.
Good to be with you, Jen.
Now, my first question to you is, was this more or less than what you had expected going into this Stockholm meeting? I mean, is this really a failure? It's just one Saturday meeting, so really, what can you expect from one working level meeting?
Yeah, well, that's right. You know, you have to be realistic about the expectations of what they're going to do. And this is a process, as the State Department noted. We can't solve 70 years in one Saturday. That said, I think the fact that the North Koreans almost immediately after the end of the day, it's good they got through the day. It's good they had 8.5 hours of discussion. But the fact that the North Koreans went public with a very negative characterization of the meeting and basically said that's it, that's not good. And the fact that we now have dueling public statements, these are not good. So I would say, in terms of my own expectations, I really didn't know, was this going to go well or not? And so I would characterize it as closer to didn't go well, but not disaster, not utter failure, but doesn't look like it went great.
So based on the conflicting remarks about their 8.5-hour-long meeting by the North Korean and U.S. negotiators, what do you think happened behind closed doors? I mean, there had been various speculations as to what Stephen Biegun had going in, so what kind of cards he had to play in there, basically. What do you think happened behind closed doors?
Well, I have two thoughts, and of course this is totally speculation. You know, I have no inside info here, but we did see leaks that looked like pretty good leaks about what the proposal might be. There may have been more than was in those leaks. For example, you know, not included in those reports in the lead-up was the question of summits. We know that Kim Jong-un has invited Donald Trump to Pyeongyang. Donald Trump has talked about Kim Jong-un visiting the White House. So that's a wild card that may be playing. We're not paying as much attention to it. We're very focused on sanctions relief and on some kind of security guarantee. But I think there's a third kind of maverick piece, and that may be playing into these working level negotiations as far as these summits and what would be required to hold the summit. And that gets to the second point, which is timing. You know, when I look at these statements, especially the North Korean statement is very focused on the timing. And actually, if you parse their phrases, they were frustrated that they didn't hear enough from the Americans, and the Americans stressed the importance of having lots of meetings. Whereas the North Koreans said, you know, their statement was, we want results from this meeting, and we're not going to come back to meet unless we're sure there's results. So there's a kind of urgency on the North Korean side, whereas the Americans seem much more process-oriented, and the North Koreans were very negative in their characterization of that.
Now, so the breakdown raises the possibility of North Korea that it will intensify its provocations, which the talks itself came days after its launch of a sea-based ballistic missile launch. But also the North's decision could amount to a negotiating tactic meant to raise its pressure on Washington also. Do you think North Korea and U.S. will meet again in 2 weeks, like how the U.S. has said that they'll meet again in Stockholm, which North Korea flatly rejected? Yeah,
2 weeks in Stockholm does seem unlikely, since the North Koreans said they're not interested in that. That would be great. But the way the North Koreans have set this up in terms of timing is Kim Jong-un, at least back in April is when I remember, he said, maybe even earlier than that, maybe at the beginning of the year, he said the Americans have to kind of deliver by the end of this year. So that's the timeline that the North Koreans are working off of. We don't know why Kim Jong-un set that timeline, but for a negotiator like Kim Jong-il, it doesn't matter. That is the timeline. Now, what is Donald Trump's timeline? Presumably, and the North Korean statement talks a lot about U.S. domestic politics, presumably Donald Trump's timeline is November 2020. You know, that's where so their timelines are off. And it creates a strange situation where there's North Korean urgency to actually get something done before the end of this year, so that Kim Jong-un can give his big New Year's speech next year and say, oh, well, things didn't go great, but in the end, we got something. You know, if nothing good happens by the end of the year, we're going to have a very negative message from Kim Jong-un, and he's promised this new way.
Right, a new way.
And we'll see what the new way is. So now, of course, that's a threat to the Americans, right, to actually negotiate. So the North Koreans have created a situation where there's this somewhat artificial pressure to do something by the end of this year. That's pressure on both sides, however. You know,
it's a pressure on themselves as well.
That's right.
Really a no exit kind of, right?
That's right. So if I would expect another contact before the end of the year. But the question now is, how long, you know, will the North Koreans kind of drag it out right up to the deadline? And also, what kind of messages now? The North Koreans have said, ball's in your court, Steve Biegun and America. That wasn't enough. You got to come back to us. So now there is kind of pressure on the American side to get them back to the table. And of course, that's not a great situation from the negotiating perspective.
Now, you know how with this impeachment drama unfolding in the U.S. with Mr. Trump, do you think this will be a factor in either speeding up the denuclearization talks with North Korea?
Well, the domestic politics in the United States are very important to this, and the North Koreans flagged it, you know, in their statements, and that's significant because they don't always do that. So they basically said the American team is kind of distracted and abusing this dialogue for their domestic political interests. So that's not good. And Donald Trump looks pretty distracted. You know, one of the views of what went wrong in Hanoi was that while it's unfolding, Donald Trump is on TV watching, you know, watching whatever the testimony was of Cohen and the Mueller report and all that. And we're kind of back into that scenario where the impeachment inquiry has begun. The domestic political pressures on Donald Trump are huge. And the general view is, who is driving engagement with North Korea? It's Donald Trump himself. You know, a lot of his principal advisors have been opposed to this. John Bolton just left, but of course we know he was always opposed to this, and he said publicly he was opposed to it. So Donald Trump is the one who kind of believes in this high-level engagement. And that means when he's distracted, and he looks very distracted right now, when he's distracted, that's not good for progress with North Korea. Now, for the North Koreans, this is a double-edged sword, you know, because on the one hand, if Donald Trump is weak, maybe they think that they can get more out of him. On the other hand, if they make a deal with a weak president, it might not last very long. And the North Koreans don't like when they make a deal that then blows up in their face and is reversed. So again, just like with the timing, the pressure is pushing in both directions.
Now, last but not least, we don't want to leave South Korea out of this. Of course, we are a direct player in this as well as we are on the peninsula. What do you think South Korea's role is in moving forward with this denuclearization process? Of course, President Moon Jae-in was recently in New York putting the North Korean denuclearization talks back in the global media spotlight. What do you think South Korea's role should be moving forward?
Well, we've talked about this, haven't we? Because we've seen extraordinary events unfold over the last year, year and a half. And Moon Jae-in has played that catalytic role. You know, we can see certain examples. I mean, he's the one, his message, shuttle diplomacy, got the first summit going. He had a meeting with Kim Jong-un to revive the fate of that. If you're Moon Jae-in, I think you do consider trying to have another meeting with Kim Jong-un, which has been elusive. You know, there's that possibility of Kim Jong-un visiting Busan. If I were Moon Jae-in, I'd be pushing very hard to try and make that possible so that President Moon could intervene at the leader level to talk with Kim, to find that missing piece, and then message that back to Donald Trump. You know, that it's kind of a Hail Mary pass the closer we get to the end of the year. But I would expect that Moon Jae-in's going to be working very hard to see, is there some role for him to play that middleman? Because we have seen where it's worked before. A lot of the times he doesn't get traction and he can't. But I would expect him to be looking very hard for that.
Right. So in any case, we have an end of the year deadline in any case, and we only have, 2 months left. So we'll have to wait and see how this works out.
That's right.
In all three countries.
That's right. It's a lot of pressure.
Yep. All right. John Delury, thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate you as always.
Pleasure.